Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being truly well-informed. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a topic that seems to be everywhere, but is often, well, misunderstood. We're talking about Generation Z in the workplace. We've got some great sources here, really comprehensive stuff looking at challenges, common myths, and maybe most importantly, some actual proven solutions. You've probably heard a lot about Gen Z, born roughly 95 to 2010. Lots of opinions floating around. But the research we dug into, it shows some pretty surprising realities that counter the usual narratives. Like, have you heard about the Gen Z stare? People see it as a disengagement, but we're going to unpack what the research actually says is going on. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, and that's exactly why this is so timely, isn't it? Gen Z is, they're really becoming a major part of the workforce now. And as our sources point out, this integration isn't always smooth. There are these generational tensions cropping up. Understanding this isn't just about, managing a new group. It's really about figuring out the future of work itself, how businesses need to adapt to, well, to thrive.
Okay, so let's unpack this, starting with some of those communication style conflicts. That Gen Z stare you mentioned, what's really behind it, according to the sources? It sounds like it's not just zoning out.
No, not at all. It's fascinating, actually. That blank look, the stare. It's often read as, disinterest or even being defiant. But from Gen Z's view, our sources say 62% use it to actually process information, especially if they're feeling a bit overwhelmed or anxious. And sometimes it's even strategic. Like if they think a request is illogical, that pause might be their way of signaling, hey, can you clarify that? Which, clashes pretty hard with older generations who often expect instant verbal feedback. So, yeah, big misinterpretations happen right there.
Okay, so interpreting it as processing time, not rudeness, that definitely shifts the perspective. And maybe that internal processing connects to their strong values. The sources mention a huge number, 89% of Gen Z, prioritizing purpose over just a paycheck. How does that cause friction?
Right, and that's a really significant point. It bumps right up against, traditional corporate culture where the bottom line was always king. The research shows about 40% of business leaders find Gen Z kind of difficult.
Difficult. Why?
Well, precisely because they challenge norms. They actually expect their employers to engage with big societal issues, climate change, racial justice, things like that. For them, it's not just show up, get paid. It's about, aligning their work with making some kind of positive impact. And yeah, that can feel pretty disruptive to the old guard.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think, that it's first of the whole conversation around mental health. The sources point to a big shift in transparency there.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a major factor for managers to grapple with now. The statistics are, frankly, quite stark. 75% of Gen Z report symptoms of depression. Now, naturally, that might mean more sick days. And unfortunately, that sometimes gets misinterpreted by older managers as, being irresponsible or not committed.
Right, the classic, they just don't want to work assumption.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here's the difference. Unlike maybe previous generations who kept quiet, 60% of Gen Z are openly asking for, even demanding, mental health support from their employers, which, on one hand, is fantastic for breaking down stigma. Huge step forward. But, it does create new challenges for management. They're suddenly navigating these very personal issues in a professional setting. It's complex.
And beyond those big ones, the sources also touch on a few other friction points, right? Like work ethic. Gen Z's focus on efficiency sometimes gets seen as, trying to skip paying their dues?
Yeah, that's a common one. It's really about a different perspective on work itself. For Gen Z, it's less about just putting in the hours, the 9-to-5 grind, and more about the actual output, the impact they make. So that whole hustle culture, paying your dues thing can feel kind of inefficient, maybe even a bit performative to them.
Which could explain why they might seem less loyal. That statistic, about 40% planning to leave within 2 years.
Exactly. It often gets framed as a lack of commitment.
Right.
But when you dig deeper, the reasons are often about finding better alignment, better purpose, faster growth, or a company that matches their ethical standards. It's not just random job hopping. And then there's their demand for transparency, for ethical accountability. Sometimes that gets perceived by more traditional hierarchies as oversharing or, challenging authority inappropriately. It's a real clash of work philosophies.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Talk about the wider corporate environment. The sources mention a disengagement crisis, 54% feeling disconnected, 63% prioritizing culture over salary. That sounds serious.
It is serious, and you can see it playing out. There's this reluctance among Gen Z to aim for traditional leadership roles.
Yeah.
Only about 6% actually prioritize becoming a manager.
Really? Only 6%?
Yeah. It's not necessarily that they lack ambition, maybe just a different kind of ambition. They want influence, but maybe not the baggage they associate with traditional management. And this definitely feeds into higher turnover, that 42% planning to change jobs within 2 years. That has real consequences for companies' succession planning, losing institutional knowledge, all of that.
And then there's this paradox. They're digital natives, but the sources talk about a skills mismatch. How does that work? It seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But being good at Instagram or TikTok doesn't automatically translate to proficiency with, say, Slack or Microsoft Teams in a professional context. There's a learning curve there. But maybe more importantly, the sources flag a major soft skills gap. Things like critical thinking, negotiation, presenting ideas clearly, even just writing a professional email.
Wow.
Yeah, a huge 94% of employers cite this gap. So digital native isn't the whole story. It's about specific workplace skills.
And are they getting help with that?
Well, that's the problem. Only 31% are actually receiving the kind of training they need to bridge that gap. So there's a disconnect there too.
Okay, another layer here is AI disruption anxiety. The sources say this is a real concern for them.
Oh, very real. And you can see why. The data shows 74% of Gen Z worry that generative AI will basically eliminate the entry-level jobs they're counting on.
74%, that's high.
It is. And it's not just vague anxiety. Look at the numbers. 58% of the graduating class of 2025 are currently unemployed. Compare that to millennials. At the same stage, it was around 25%.
Oof, that's a stark difference.
It really is. So that fear, that anxiety about their place in an AI-driven future, it's grounded in some pretty tough realities they're facing right now.
Let's dig into this idea of institutional distrust then. The sources suggest Gen Z is generally more skeptical of established institutions. Why is that? What's behind it?
Well, you have to look at their formative experiences, right?
Yeah.
It starts deep. Only 5% of Gen Z actually believe the world is fundamentally fair. 5%, yeah. And their trust in big institutions, government, media, corporations, it took a nosedive, dropped about 20% just between 2020 and 2025. Think about what they grew up with. The pandemic, disrupting education and careers, constant exposure to fake news, seeing corporate greenwashing firsthand.
So they've seen promises broken, basically.
Pretty much. All these things have really chipped away at their faith in the systems that previous generations might have taken more for granted.
And going back to communication, what looks like irresponsibility or disengagement might actually be something else entirely, more complex processes happening.
Absolutely. That pause, that stare we talked about. It could be neurological, just needing time to process an overload of information. Or it could be an active rejection of what they see as forced enthusiasm. They tend to be pretty anti-performative. They value authenticity.
So no fake smiles.
Right? Or it might just be about precision. They might hesitate to respond because they want to be certain, they want to be right, not just fast. And remember the values piece. The sources show 66% would actually reject a company if it stays silent on social justice issues they care about.
So if the company's values don't align,
their disengagement might be a direct signal of that misalignment. It's not laziness, it's a values conflict playing out.
Okay, that's a really crucial way to look at it. So considering all this, the skepticism, the different communication styles, what does it mean for hiring them into responsible roles? Are there specific dangers or risks companies need to watch out for?
Yeah, the sources do flag a few potential risks companies need to be mindful of. First, retention is a big one. That 40% willing to quit without another job lined up, that creates potential instability, especially in key roles. High churn is costly.
Definitely. What else?
Well, there's the potential for experience gaps. Because they've entered the workforce in a different era, maybe with less exposure to certain complex pre-AI business scenarios, there should be blind spots in high-stakes decision-making. There's also a note of caution about AI overdependence, a tendency to maybe automate tasks that really need nuanced human judgment could compromise quality.
Okay.
And finally, those communication differences we discussed, the misread stare, maybe overly blunt feedback, if not managed well, those could potentially damage client relationships or team dynamics. It requires proactive understanding.
Right. So a lot of challenges, a lot of potential pitfalls if things aren't handled correctly. But let's pivot to solutions. The sources say companies need to adapt, maybe even radically. How do they start rebuilding trust?
Well, interestingly, the sources point to radical transparency. That sounds counterintuitive, maybe?
A little, yeah. How does that work?
McKinsey found it actually builds trust. Being open, authentic, even vulnerable as an organization. It shows you're not hiding anything. Then there's the whole data and AI ethics piece. That's huge for Gen Z. 61% say digital trust is as important as price. So clear, ethical guidelines are non-negotiable.
Makes sense.
And finally, it's about action on social issues, publicly aligning policies with things like sustainability, diversity, walking the talk. Because 72% believe companies have to play a role in advancing social justice.
Okay, so transparency and alignment. What about bridging that communication gap day to day? Practical strategies.
Yeah, some really concrete things came up. Soft skills apprenticeships, for one, pairing Gen Z with mentors for real-time coaching on those workplace interactions.
Like learning by doing with feedback.
Exactly. And changing feedback systems. Moving away from the dreaded annual review toward more frequent, like weekly check-ins. The data shows 79% of Gen Z engage much better with that constant loop. And for managers, specific training on how to interpret things like the stare, seeing it as processing time, not resistance, that can de-escalate so many misunderstandings.
So training managers to understand, not just demanding Gen Z conform?
Precisely. It's a two-way street.
Beyond training, what about bigger structural changes? How can companies fundamentally shift how they operate to integrate Gen Z better?
Well, employers really need to recognize the game has changed. One key shift is redesigning entry-level jobs,
How so?
focusing them on inherently human skills. Empathy, creativity, complex problem solving, skills that AI complements rather than replaces. Flexibility also needs to become the default, not a perk. We're talking hours, location. 54% prioritize that over more pay. That's a huge signal.
Flexibility by default. Okay.
Yeah. And finally, thinking about advancement. Offering rapid career tracks. 32% want work that has an impact immediately. They value accelerated growth, not necessarily the slow, steady climb.
The sources also mention specific managerial strategies for engagement, right? Things that link Gen Z needs to actual business results.
Yes, absolutely. For career growth, think lattice, not ladder.
Lattice, like moving
Yeah.
sideways as well as up.
Exactly. Cross-functional moves, internal project marketplaces. Companies doing this see 76% of Gen Z staying longer. It offers variety and faster skill building. On mental health, manageable workload policies, access to therapy support, that's not just nice to have. It can boost productivity by up to 60% when people feel supported.
60%, that's significant.
Huge. For community, things like affinity groups, intentional hybrid work bonding activities, those can lift engagement by 58%. And back to purpose, actually putting impact metrics in the job descriptions, that directly taps into the 89% who prioritize purpose-driven work. It makes the meaning clear from day one.
So listening to all this, it really feels like we need to reframe the whole conversation about Gen Z. Maybe these traits that seem challenging are actually what modern workplaces desperately need.
I think that's exactly right. What looks like a challenge is often a strength in disguise. Their comfort with tech. That accelerates digital transformation. Their demand for values and purpose. That pushes companies towards more ethical, sustainable practices, which benefits everyone, attracts all talent, even their anti-hustle stance. That focus on balance and efficiency, that could be the antidote to burnout culture, creating healthier workplaces for everybody.
Deloitte talks about needing a speed of evolution matching the external environment. It sounds like Gen Z is pushing companies to actually do that.
They are, and the data backs it up. Companies that are adapting now, implementing those lattice paths, being transparent about values, they're seeing 25% higher Gen Z retention and 2.1 times the innovation growth.
Wow, 2.1x innovation.
Yeah. It's powerful. As the European Commission report put it, basically, employers must recognize things have shifted and adapt how they engage younger generations. It's not really optional anymore if you want to compete.
So maybe the final thought here is, the problem isn't Generation Z. Perhaps it's the outdated systems and expectations that need the real overhaul. Something for all of us, especially those in leadership, to think about: how can we adapt our organizations not just to accommodate, but to truly leverage the immense potential this generation brings, moving from friction to real strategic advantage?